Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, Dr. John Kloppenborg returns to the podcast to discuss the geography in the Gospel of Luke. So, Dr. Kloppenborg, does Luke make the geography issue in Mark worse, or does he actually make some corrections?
I think in general he complicates the geography, that is to make it a little less intelligible, and that's in part because he's not only using Mark, which has its own problems, but that he's fusing Mark with another source that has geographical references in it, namely the so-called Q source. And my conclusion about Luke is that Luke doesn't actually have any real geographical knowledge of the interior of Palestine. And so when he connects Q material with its geographical allusions to the Markan material, he can't coordinate Q with Markan material because he just doesn't know what the interior of Palestine looks like. And so one ends up with some rather peculiar sequencing of materials. I tell my students sort of humorously that if you decide to take a trip to the Holy Land, don't take the Gospel of Luke with you as a travel guide, because you're not going to get to where you think you want to go.
What are some clear examples of Luke making some very serious mistakes regarding the geography?
Well, he makes mistakes in two different respects. Luke, in the ancient world, there are settlements that are called polis. That is, they're called cities. And a city in the ancient world is not only uh, uh, a settlement with a certain kind of population size, but a city also in the ancient world is assumed to have certain kinds of amenities, like a stadium, a theater, an agora, that is a central public space, and so forth. And Luke has a tendency to call many places in the interior of Palestine polis, the cities, where we're pretty sure that these never were cities. Uh, Jerusalem might qualify as a city. Tiberias and Sepphoris would perhaps qualify as a city. But when you say that Capernaum is a city, or Nazareth is a city, or Nain is a city, that's a misnomer. These aren't cities in any kind of technical sense. So that's the first kind of difficulty that one encounters. And then another difficulty, perhaps the most obvious one, is uh, uh, in about chapter 9, in chapter 9 of Luke, Luke signals a geographical transition where Jesus starts moving from the area of Galilee, starting to move down south on his trip towards Jerusalem. Uh, in literary terms, this is called the travel section of Luke, or the central section of Luke, that where the literary trope that Luke uses is, as Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem, a number of things happen. Well, at chapter 10, so Jesus is already heading towards the south. It's in chapter 10 that you have the woes against the Galilean cities of Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. Now, he hasn't been near there in the first part of Luke for several chapters now. And if one were looking at a map and asking, why is he attacking these Galilean towns where he's no longer in Galilee? Wouldn't it make more sense to have the attack on the Galilean towns, say, back in chapter 7? Well, that's not where he puts it. He puts it in chapter 10. And so that creates a kind of a puzzle if you are reading the Gospel of Luke with a map of the interior of Palestine in front of you're immediately going to be puzzled why Luke has Jesus attacking towns that he's left a long time ago.
I want to focus on what you just said earlier about Luke mentioning towns that that scholars are pretty sure were never cities. So is he technically like making up cities that didn't even exist? Is that what's going on here?
Well, he knows names, so he knows names like Nazareth and things like that, but he just calls them a city. Um, it's also worth noting, and other scholars have noted this, that as you read through the book of Acts, where Paul and his companions are traveling first throughout Asia Minor and then through Macedonia and Achaia, that the only places that get mentioned are cities. So the cities of Lystra and Antioch, and later on cities of Troas and Philippi, Thessaloniki, and eventually Athens and Corinth. Now, these are cities. Um, but Luke's, uh, when he talks about Paul's journeys, even though Paul is clearly moving in areas that are populated in small villages, Luke never mentions them. It's as if he simply moves instantly from one city to another city, and the intervening space is of no interest to Luke. That's been observed for a long time. And in that sense, the book of Acts is a book about cities, not about countryside, not about the roads between cities, because Luke just seems not to be interested in anything other than cities. So when he comes to talk about Palestine, I think you still see that same tendency that cities are the important places to be, and so he renames places that we know were never cities. Uh, Nazareth, for example, is had a population of perhaps 100 to 200 people, with none of the amenities that a polis had. But Luke will still call it a polis, a city. Um, uh, he thinks in urban terms rather than in that rural areas are at all of interest or of importance to him.
Why do you think Luke is doing that? Why is he thinking in those urban terms? Why is he referring to places that are as cities when they're not? What do you think the point of that is?
That's a good question, and I don't think there's a terribly good answer. We might say that Luke is a city dweller, uh, and so he tends to think that the important stuff that happens is going to happen in a city. Um, uh, it's I've observed in another context that when Luke edits the parable of the lost sheep, or the parable of the shepherd, depending on how we want to call it, it's uh, it's interesting that he says if one sheep should get lost, uh, the shepherd goes out and looks for it, and when he finds it, he comes back and invites his neighbors, and they have a kind of party. Now, anybody who is a shepherd who knows anything about transhumance knows that when a sheep wanders off, there's no guarantee that you will find it, because wild animals, bears, lions, and other kinds of predatory beasts sometimes take it. Sometimes other shepherds stole it. Sometimes you just don't find it. Yet Luke speaks as if the finding of the sheep is going to be an inevitable happening by a shepherd. What that tells me is that Luke actually doesn't know very much about shepherding. Uh, uh, Matthew, however, in Matthew's version, he says, and if he finds it, then uh, uh, you know, uh, then he will rejoice and so forth. Matthew is at least closer to the practice of shepherding, and he knows very well that if you have a lost sheep, there's no guarantee that you'll find it. Luke, I think, as a city dweller, just assumes that, of course, when you lose a sheep, you're going to it's going to turn up. I think that comes from Luke living in a living situation where he's he's somewhat disconnected from some of the agricultural realities that happen out in the countryside. So we might say that he lives in a city, he thinks in civic terms, he doesn't really think in rural terms at all. And so when he retells the story of Jesus, he's got names of places, and he just makes the assumption that these are probably cities, even though technically speaking they're not.
You said earlier that you wouldn't recommend to anyone traveling to Israel to use Luke as a map. Does Luke misplace locations as well? Get locations wrong completely?
I think he's made a mistake in locating Emmaus. He says it's about 7.5 kilometers from Jerusalem. I think it's more likely that it's more like 20 kilometers down the valley that leads out to the plain called the Shekelah. I think he's misplaced that one. But in general, I think he's got apart from in Palestine, the interior of Palestine itself, where I don't think he actually knows where any of these places are, and therefore he places them in his narrative at a point where it's not like where, you know, as I said, it doesn't make any sense for Jesus to rail against the Galilean cities when he's no longer in Galilee. Why would he do that? Um, um, but when Luke hits Jerusalem, and especially when he hits the coastal areas, he's got the general sense of the location of places right. And that comes from some kind of knowledge that he has. Either, well, in this article, I distinguish between uh, what I would call local knowledge. That is, each of us has local knowledge of the cities that we live in, and so we could say to a visitor, uh, not just you go to the city and you go to a Starbucks, but we can say you get to the Starbucks by going down this road a mile, turning to the left and turning to the right again, and there it is. That's local knowledge. Um, or local knowledge is the kind of knowledge that we have when we say, when I go to Jerusalem and enter the Jaffa Gate, I know that I go downhill before I get to the Temple Mount. So that's the kind of local knowledge that someone who lives there knows. There's also cartographic knowledge. That is, I don't happen to know where Naples. I know where I can find Naples, Florida, on a map because I can get a map and I can say, I can see that it's so and so many miles away from Miami or whatever. Um, but I've never been there, so I can't actually convey the kind of local knowledge that I would have of Toronto or of Jerusalem or other places where I've lived. Uh, and then you're in the situation where all you know is the name, and you have to kind of guess uh, where where on a map or where in the terrain of the earth you would find this. So there's plenty of places where I've got name knowledge. So I know uh, I know the names of a number of American cities, but I couldn't tell you anything about that city. And if I had a map, I could probably eventually find the city on a map. But I don't have any real knowledge apart from the name. And if I didn't have a map, then and I was sort of required to uh, create a story that featured that American city or American town, I would probably make all sorts of errors to someone who lived in the area or even who had cartographic knowledge. They would say, this guy clearly has no idea of where these things are because he's got all sorts of details wrong. So I'd say that, Luke, and when it comes to the interior of Palestine, Luke knows names, and that's about all he knows.
When you compare Matthew's geography to Luke and Mark's, does Matthew seem seem to be the most developed and the most correct against the other two?
Yes, I think so. And I can't recall offhand where Matthew does some correcting of Mark in details, but when Matthew talks about places in the interior of Palestine, he seems to know basically where they are relative to one another. Um, that's not so obvious in the case of Mark, and it's certainly not obvious at all when you get to Luke. And that would suggest to me that Matthew um, lives either in uh, uh, in the Galilee. Andy Overman has argued that the gospel is written in Sepphoris. Maybe that's true, but I think Matthew is at least careful enough with names to suggest that he's got a pretty good sense of where things are. And so when Jesus travels, he travels in a way that's intelligible, um, whereas that's really not the case with Luke.
So Matthew gets locations right. He doesn't really make the kind of major errors that Luke does. He doesn't misplace locations or claim that
Yeah,
something is further away than it actually is.
yeah. The interesting thing about the Gospels is that the writer of the Gospel of John, or at least the sources that the Gospel of John use, have something like local knowledge of Jerusalem. So if you read the Synoptic Gospels and ask, what is in Jerusalem? You don't end up with any answers. You know that Jerusalem is close enough to the Mount of Olives that Jesus can move back and forth between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, but that's pretty much all you know. When you read the Gospel of John, you discover that there is a pool of Siloam, which we know where it is now. There's also a pool of Bethesda, which is a flushing pool. That is, it's a pool that periodically um, it's called a it's connected to what's called a siphon spring, so that there's periodic disturbances in the water from the flushing that happens from the spring that feeds it. So John knows that, or at least whoever's behind John, the sources, they actually have that kind of local knowledge, and it's John's gospel that knows the name of the valley between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem. That's the Kidron, uh, and there's a spring that goes through there. So John, John or his sources have interesting local knowledge of Jerusalem that the synoptic writers don't have, either because they've not been there or they're not really interested in conveying any kind of local knowledge of Jerusalem.
Do you think this seems to fit what early Christians were saying in texts like the Anti-Marsonite Prologue, that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Jerusalem? They say that Luke was written in, I think it was Cappadocia or somewhere in, no, not Cappadocia, so somewhere in Greece is what the Anti-Marsonite Prologue says. It said something like that. Um,
I wouldn't discount those prologues entirely, uh, especially when what is said starts to make sense of the data that you find. Now, it could be that it makes sense because it's actually built on those data, um, although it's pretty hard uh, to figure out why the prologue would say that the Gospel of Luke was written in Cappadocia, because this is not an area that's especially featured in his Gospel. Um, but that it's not written in Palestine is interesting. Uh, and that certainly would cohere with uh, with the internal data from the gospel itself.
I want to make a slight correction. The Anti-Marsonite Prologue says Luke was an Antioch and Syrian. Uh, it doesn't actually. I'm looking at it right now. Actually, it doesn't say it was written in Cappadocia. But I misremembered slightly there.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's still coherent with if it's written in Antioch, which is quite a good ways away from Galilee or the interior of Palestine. The point is, for me, that I don't think Luke betrays any local knowledge of Palestine because his geography is so inconsistent with where we know things to have been. So Antioch or somewhere else. There's been some interesting arguments made about where Luke and Acts are written. It's um, if you look at Luke's description of travel, Luke knows, for example, that when you sail from Tyre uh, uh, towards the towards Asia Minor, you pass not on the windward side of Cyprus, but on the lee side of Cyprus, which is in fact the way you would have traveled. It keeps you out of the winds that are pushing in your face. Um, and there are a few other details that scholars, uh, especially in the 19th century, looking at Lucan geography, said, he actually does seem to know about how travel in the Northeast Aegean works. That would qualify as local knowledge for me. That is, if you have allusion to knowledge that you would only get if you lived there or if you were intimate with someone who did live in that area. Uh, that that would be an interesting finding. Um,
Another thing that's interesting about this prologue is it says that Mark was written in Italy, and I've heard that scholars uh, detected Latinisms in some of the language of the Gospel of Mark. Would you
yeah,
say
so,
that would also fit that paradigm?
yeah. So uh, when when Mark refers to the centurion at Jesus' execution, he calls it a centurion, whereas the Matthew and Luke, using Q, call him a hecaton arpos, that is a leader of 100, which is what a centurion is. But they use the Greek term. Mark uses the Latin term. Similarly, Mark uses the word census, which is a Latinism. Um, uh, and there's a few other Latinisms that he uses. Of course, the demon that is thrown out of the possessed person in chapter 5 is called legio, legion, with the Latin word for a legion. So there are these kinds of Latinisms that show up in Mark, um, and that has encouraged some scholars to say, well, that perhaps that means that he writes in an environment where Latin as well as Greek is present, and Italy would be an example where that is the case. One could also argue that you don't have to live in Italy to know what a legion is, because the legions are stationed outside of Italy, especially in places like uh, Syria and Palestine. And you don't really need to have come from Italy to know what a census was, since the Romans took periodic censuses. So uh, a lot depends on which words uh, are used, which Latinisms appear in Mark, and just how commonly they would have been known outside of a Latin-speaking environment like Italy or Rome. But you're right that there's a number of scholars who would place the composition of Mark in Rome, or at least in Italy, where which would make sense of some of those Latinisms that appear.
I think there's a couple, but I'm not certain. I think that because of the Latinisms, that could suggest that the original form of Mark was written in Latin and it was later penned in Greek. What do you think of that?
I haven't encountered that, but in order to show that's the case, what one would have to do is to look at documents uh, that we know to have been penned in Latin and for which we have a Greek translation, and look at the way in which Latin syntax is then replicated in the target language, namely Greek. Um, that's been done extensively in thinking about whether Gospels, including Mark or Q or Matthew, was originally written in Hebrew, because then you can measure Matthew or Q or Mark's Greek against Hebrew syntax. And I think the answer right now is these were not written in Hebrew. They were written in Greek, because they have grammatical devices that you actually can't say in Hebrew. Um, that doesn't mean that there are not Semitisms in the Synoptic Gospels. There certainly are, but Semitisms are different from translation in Greek. So you'd have to do the same kind of exercise with Mark, comparing it to documents that we know to have been written in Latin and then translated into Greek. And there's a number of those. So a number of imperial decrees that you find in Egypt, especially, we know to have been composed in Latin, but they show up in a Greek translation. So one would have to look carefully at the way in which Latin is transformed into Greek syntax, and then see if Mark displays any of those grammatical characteristics. As I say, this is not something that I've ever worked on, and I haven't even heard of anyone making that argument. But that would be a testable argument. That is, um, doing, as I say, sort of looking at other examples of translation Greek or translation Latin into Greek, and see if Mark's Greek corresponds in some meaningful way to those kinds of linguistic frequencies.
Could the Semitisms in the Synoptic Gospels indicate that they were using sources that are written in Hebrew?
It could, but Semitisms also exist in the Septuagint. Um, so distinguishing a Semitism that exists only in Hebrew or Aramaic from a Semitism from isolating those and say, do those actually appear in the Gospels, as opposed to the Semitisms, the many Semitisms that we find in the Septuagint. Um, so that Gospel writers use the Septuagint, at least say Matthew, for example, in his biblical quotations, I think is pretty much uncontrovertible. It's clear that some of Matthew's quotations are Septuagintal quotations. So you don't have to imagine that he's freely translating from Hebrew. But there are other quotations in Matthew that could be translation Greek. That is, they could be Greek that comes from uh, uh, directly from a Hebrew source. But I think, as in terms of the composition of the gospel itself, its language of composition is Greek and not some other language. And you just mentioned a couple of the indices. So, as you probably know, in constructing a sentence in Hebrew, uh, an independent clause, the verb is likely going to come first, then the subject, and then verbal complements and direct objects and so forth. Um, and you can look at the way in which the Septuagint translation of the Pentateuch in Hebrew has largely stuck to that sequence of placing verbs first and then subjects and then verbal complements. Um, so the Septuagint translation of the Pentateuch still mimics uh, the structure of Hebrew in the way in which it constructs sentences. So you look for verb, subject, object orders, um, and then if you start looking for verb, subject, object sequences in the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke, you'll find that you don't find them with sufficiently high frequency to suggest that that there's a Semitic original lying behind uh, the lying behind the Greek of Matthew or the Greek of Mark. Another index would be, as I think you know, in Hebrew, um, a definite article cannot be separated from the substantive to which it belongs. Um, so you say haaretz, the land, or ha'am, the people. In Greek, you can separate the article from the noun easily and stick an adjective in between hakalos anthropos, the good person, uh, or hakalos, hakale gay, the beautiful land, where the ha, or the hey, is separated by a number of letters uh, from its noun. In translation Greek, what you expect to find is a higher incidence of articles attached to the substantive, that is, right next door to the substantive, because that's the way they're going to appear in the source language in Hebrew. Uh, but when you look at the Greek of Matthew or the Greek of Mark, Greek of Luke, you'll see that they're perfectly happy to separate an article from its substantive and interpose an adjective or sometimes a participial phrase or something like that, which you just can't do in Hebrew. Um, there's, several other grammatical features that are possible in Greek that are impossible in a Semitic language. And if you see a sufficiently high frequency of those un-Hebrew or un-Semitic constructions, I think you have to conclude that this document was not composed in another language and then translated into Greek. Otherwise, you would find the kind of echo or the kind of ghost of Semitic syntax too strongly. I think most of us who know other modern languages, uh, you meet a person uh, who is not speaking fluent English because they're thinking in Italian, or they're thinking in Polish, or they're thinking in modern Hebrew, and you hear Polish or Italian or German or Hebrew syntax uh, um, showing through in the way in which they construct an English sentence. That tells you that there is another language operating, another grammatical system operating in their speech, and it's kind of leaking through into the way in which they speak English. But when you encounter a speaker where you see none of that kind of uh, none of those kinds of features, then you assume that they're speaking English because they're a native speaker. That doesn't mean that they don't know another language. They might, but they've assimilated English syntax so much that you can't tell that they might be uh, mentally translating from another language, or maybe they're just not translating from another language. They're simply a native speaker.
Final question for today. In the paper, in your article, you mentioned that Luke is heavily dependent on the kind of cartographic imagination that is evidenced by the itinera and the tabula uh, Putingarina, as the
Yeah.
first part of this paper has argued. Luke seems to have been indebted to something like akin to Agrippa's map. How did you make that determination?
Yeah, that was an unexpected finding. Uh, I had originally started writing this article simply looking at Luke's, in the gospel material, looking at uh, his geographical references and asking the question, does he really know the interior of Palestine or not? And my conclusion there was he doesn't know it because he's misplaced enough places that tells me he doesn't know it. Then when I started working on Acts, what I noticed is that Luke uh, does actually understand the the relationship between Joppa and Caesarea and Tyre and Sidon. That is, he's got the relative locations of those places right. He knows very little about the cities themselves. That is, when he talks about the disciples being in Joppa or in Caesarea or other places, he doesn't have the kind of knowledge that I would call local knowledge, where the kind of knowledge where you can say you could go down this street and turn to the right, and here is a synagogue or here is a temple or something like that. So he knows the places, he knows the relative locations of those places, and he even seems to know how long it's going to take you to walk from one place to another. So if you look at the travel times that he imagines, say between Jaffa and Caesarea, he's got that right. That is, he knows how many days it's going to take you to get there. So when I saw that, I wondered, how would he know that information? And at that point, I started looking at the itineraries that we have. So in the early part of the Roman Empire, itineraries were created, partly to guide travelers, to say, if you're in such and such a place, it's going to, it's 12 Roman miles from A to B, or it's 30 Roman miles from A to B, which means that you're going to take a day or 2 days or 3 days. And we have, still we have the remains of Roman milestones on many of these roads, which tells you exactly how far one place is from another place and how many days it takes to get there. These maps all often contain that knowledge, and so I I thought to myself, maybe it's the case that Luke has actually never been to the Levantine coast. That is, he doesn't actually have local knowledge of Joppa or Caesarea or Tyre and Sidon, but he's got the kind of knowledge that you would get from looking at Agrippa's map of the Roman Empire, or some of these itineraries that we have. And one of the maps that actually figured quite importantly, it turned out, was the Putinger map, which is the date that we have for it is 1260 or something like that. So it's very much later in the form that we've got. But one of the interesting features of the Putinger map, noted by those who work on it, Richard Talbert and others, is that the Putinger map names cities which by 1260 and even by the early Byzantine period did not exist anymore. So the Putinger map has Pompeii on it, and it has Stabia on it. Now, though after 79, those cities didn't exist. They were covered over by lava. The fact that the Putinger map still has some of those cities on it suggests that at least the predecessors of the Putinger map had those places on it. That is, the map goes back to much earlier, or parts of the map go back to much earlier cartographers who did understand also the relationship of let's say Joppa to Caesarea to Tyre to Sidon. And if those maps were equipped also with milestone designations, that is, little dots or little numbers that tell you that it's so and so many Roman miles from A to B, that's the kind of knowledge that Luke could have had access to, that allowed him to create a realistic imagination of the physical relationships of one town to another. I think when you get to the Northeast Aegean, then Luke has something more like local knowledge. That is, Luke has been there because he understands exactly how sailing works, how many days it takes to get from this place to that place, and the kind of dangers that you can encounter in sailing. So as you move, especially as you move towards the Northeast Aegean, the density of Luke's knowledge of geography increases rather importantly. So I would say, using my typology, he's got name knowledge when he talks about the interior of Palestine. He's got something like cartographic knowledge when he talks about the Levantine coast. But he's got something that approaches local knowledge when he's talking about the northeastern part of the Aegean.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Kloppenborg.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.